Right. Hi, everyone. If we are with Rooted and Designing with and Not For, I just pasted into the chat a link to our slide deck in case that's helpful for you to follow along as we're talking. Oh no. So just a little bit about us. My name is Val Neumark. My pronouns are she and they, and I am one of the co-founders of Rooted. My title within Rooted is the Director of Strategy and Education, and I live in the San Francisco East Bay on the stolen lands of the Chochenyo Ohlone people. We like to begin events with the land acknowledgement to challenge the erasure of Indigenous and Native peoples' knowledge and practices as part of our commitment to working to dismantle systems of oppression. As we're continuing our presentation, we'd like to invite you to share your name, pronouns, organization name, any access needs, and your land acknowledgement, if you know it, into the chat. We'll also paste a link in case you don't know and would like to learn more.
My name is Mabel Colón. My pronouns are she and her, and I live in New York City on Wappinger and Muncie Lenape land. I'm really excited that we do this for the reasons Val mentioned. I'm a user experience and service designer at Rooted, and I've been at Rooted for about 2 years.
Thanks. So Rooted's team is distributed across the country, coming from varying backgrounds, but we have a united vision, and that is to be rooted in our community. We focus not just on the agency side of our work of building websites and doing brand strategy, but also creating necessary spaces for strategic thinking and growth. We really want to use communications as a leverage to advance equity in our communities, and that we can use not just communications, but also technology to heal and empower rather than divide. So for a few years now, Rooted has been reframing all of our work in alignment with the Design Justice Network principles and the Liberatory Design process. Here on screen, you can see one of the first principles of the Design Justice Network, and we'll share a few more as we continue through our presentation. But before we go any further, let me just say that if you don't already think of yourself as a designer, now is the time. Anyone who produces something with intention, affects or creates forms, structures, or patterns of any kind is a designer. Sometimes we get into debates between designers and developers, but really, we're all designers in our own ways. Developers out there, you decide the structures for your Drupal sites, how you're going to build them, and you do so with intention toward clear outcomes. So yes, you too are a designer. Design justice rethinks these design processes that we use every day, and it centers people who are often unrepresented or marginalized by design and uses collaborative, creative practices to address the deepest challenges our community faces. There are 10 principles put out by the Design Justice Network, and we highly recommend going and taking a look at them, and we'll paste them in the chat in just a minute. Today's session will be focused on how Rooted's been working to embody these principles throughout all of our design and development processes, and that we use the liberatory design process as one of the frameworks or tools in order to be able to do that. So let's get started. Oh, no. Okay, sorry, hold on. There we go. Nope.
Community agreements, creating a space of belonging. Everything begins with designing the spaces we share. Before starting with new clients and before any training or coaching experiences, we set a foundation with our community agreements. This foundation sets the tone for how our partnership and process works towards sustaining, healing, and empowering. Take a minute to read through these on your own. You'll get a small break from hearing us, and I will directly speak to a few in a second. So first, we'd like to elevate number 4 and number 8. As you probably experience with team or partners, there are power dynamics present. They are a client, you are a vendor, everyone has different roles with their teams, different voices and opinions often carry different weight. Agreements 4 and 8 are reminders to notice these dynamics, name them, and invite everyone to share space differently, differently than we have in the past. This pause can often feel very healing. We also like to elevate number 5, that we want to assume best intent. We are also opening ourselves to be more vulnerable together. The impact of our words will carry that much more weight. These processes and experiences will be iterative and imperfect as we learn together and in public. During an Othering and Belonging conference, John A. Powell said, part of this is giving space for things not to be perfect. I'll forget something, you will forget something. Someone might say something that is misunderstood or something they should not have said. So not giving people a hall pass, but holding onto our connectedness, even in these spaces where we are not perfect. Which is no spaces, which is all spaces. Slowing down and naming what is coming up in spaces together allows the space for acknowledging what we, when we misstep. Rather than reproducing harm that may have arisen before, we can co-design a new way of being in partnership that sustains, heals, and maybe even liberates.
So here are a couple more principles that we really like to hold in our work. And for the most part, we do this because design work is fraught with power and identity dynamics. And too often the design process does not center the needs of those most impacted by its outcomes. As designers, we hold a lot of power and therefore responsibility. And if we see ourselves just as experts versus seeing ourselves as facilitators and amplifiers of community members' voices, particularly those who have been historically underrepresented, it's really easy to reproduce the very inequitable outcomes that we're seeking to change. As many of you know and have probably experienced, this doesn't just happen. We have to begin by taking a look within ourselves, our teams, and within the systems in which we're working to understand better how we can change the outcomes that are being produced. No, I did it again. Every time. Sorry, y'all. When I'm trying to go forward, I clicked the wrong side of the slide. As you can see, lots of things in our presentation are linked, and we've put that link to the full presentation into the chat if you want to follow along or click and look at any of these resources. So as we said, the Design Justice Network principles are the foundation of our work. And then we use the Liberatory Design process as the framework to guide each stage in our project process. Liberatory Design is the product of a collaboration between Tanya Anesi, David Clifford, Susie Weiss, and the National Equity Projects, Victor Carey and Tom Malarkey. As you can see, there are 6 phases. With notice and reflect there in the center and see the system around the outside. And this is really meant to be a flexible model. You can come in and out of different stages as you like, and using the card deck that they have, it really gives you some places for reflection and thinking along the way. Creating time to notice and reflect through each stage is an important way that we really can design with and not for stakeholders. I tend to keep the Liberatory Design process card deck with its really great mindsets open on my desktop most days to help me be increasingly self-aware of how my identities, beliefs, biases, and values may be coming into play within the design process. So this is just a little infographic that we put together here to show how we're using the Liberatory Design process to identify equity challenges on the individual level, the organization level, so within our team, and then within our partnerships with clients. It's so easy to get caught up in the timeline and deliverables of a project. So slowing down and making space to notice and reflect is essential to equity-centered practice. Otherwise, we're simply reproducing our white dominant culture's senses of urgency, perfectionism, and the power power dynamics, which leads to the same exclusionary outputs. Instead, if we slow down and create the space to identify, understand, and design new strategies for the equity challenges that we face. Using the liberatory design process gives us a framework to navigate equity challenges across these different levels. And it's, as I said, I use the mindset cards and process cards every day to help me do this. We'll introduce you to these tools in a little bit more depth and share some examples of how we use them in our project process. And again, the key to all of this is planning your notice and reflection time into your workflows.
So when doing this with clients, we'll often take the time during our kickoff or our first project meeting to notice and reflect together. So we do this in 2 steps. The first is a 5-minute individual journaling exercise using the prompts on screen. It doesn't have to be 5 minutes. It can be shorter. This helps us as individuals notice and reflect where our own identities, lived experiences, and biases are present in the design process. The second is a mindset exercise. This reflection exercise is designed to help us recognize and interrupt cultural habits and become even more self-aware. We combine this with a mindset exercise and a pair share, which we will walk you through next. I think we've already provided the...
Oh yeah, I just pasted the link.
Okay, great. We usually spend about 10 minutes on this activity. And it'll often be the first homework we'll give during the meeting. It'll often be the first homework that we give, but we'll also give time during the meeting to reflect. If there are 5 people on a call, you can do this as one group, depending. So just keep in mind the power dynamics that might exist, or divide into pairs if it's more people. Leave enough time for them to each share 2 to 3 minutes. We ask clients to take a look at the Liberatory Design cards and select 1 to 3 mindsets that they want to set intention around. And we'll share a few that people tend to share over and over again. But we're not going to do this right now. The following slides are a few mindsets that we talk about with clients during the activity that we've outlined in this slide. So the first is practice self-awareness. Liberatory design requires us to minimize the effects of our biases and maximize our potential for non-oppressive partnerships. Practicing self-awareness increases our capacity to work with humility, with curiosity, and courage. Some thoughts and questions to help navigate this conversation or this thought process are usually acknowledge and challenge our assumptions. To surface what we don't know, ask what is unfamiliar to me in this situation, why? Ask how does my identity, my race, my class, gender, or other identifier position me in society relative to privilege and oppression? How might my identity impact people and process? Seek out new knowledge about privilege and oppression to expand our awareness and understanding of equity. The next one we usually bring up are recognize oppression. Inequities do not exist in a vacuum. They are shaped by oppression and design decisions made across history. Oppression plays out on many levels: individual, interpersonal, institutional, systemic, structural, and across various forms of identity. Liberatory design enables us to better understand oppression's causes and more effectively design to catalyze liberation. Thoughts and questions tend to include: name identity-related patterns of inequity we see in this context. Listen to the experiences of those most negatively impacted. Identify what designs, so what structures, policies, processes, and practices over time have produced these, and be it intentionally or unintentionally. Notice how our own identities and positional power shape what we see and hear and how we frame challenges. And the last one that we that we usually bring up and we want to share today is building relational trust. So relational trust is a glue in liberatory design. When working across differences on difficult challenges, teams must invest in each other to develop trust, share openly, and collaborate authentically. If we are courageous in identifying and processing emotions with our team, we create opportunities for healing and prevent distortion of our work. Thoughts and questions tend to include facilitate personal connection by inviting people to share what matters to them, dedicate time and space for people to bring forward their full selves and identities, demonstrate the importance of non-judgmental listening, create space for community to reflect, express, and process thoughts and emotions, cultivate a culture that invites dialogue and collective sense-making.
So in our project process, that last mindset there is particularly important. And is one that we really use ongoing. And the example we're going to share with you today will touch on quite a number of aspects of that last one. So as we shared, creating the space to notice and reflect at each stage in the design process is an important way we can continue to design with rather than for them. Our stakeholders, I mean, spending the time needed to really understand their needs and motivations, iterating on our ideas as we go, allows us to center their voices and prioritize the impact of our work on the community that it's for over our own intentions. So before we share our example of using liberatory design in a particular instance, we wanted to show how we align each stage of our process with the different phases of the framework. This will help give some context to the example later. What we've shown you up till now are some of the experiences we use when we're beginning a new project and setting the tone for our partnership, whether it's with a new client or an ongoing client and just a new project. And once we've done our first round of noticing and reflecting, but notice that we do this many times throughout the project, we'll continue through the see the system phase and work with clients to examine how their values, vision, and mission are being actuated through their communications, operations, and programs. And once we have a clear understanding of the dynamics in which this project sits, we move into the empathize and the define phases, where we map the full landscape of audiences, both those who an organization works with directly and indirectly, and spend considerable time identifying common values, needs, and motivations, as well as starting to dig deeper into the identity challenges that might be arising. Examples of this are things like considering which audience members' perspectives may have been underrepresented in the past versus which audience voices may have carried too much weight. At this stage, we often visit the transform power mindset card and ask ourselves, how are we working with those most impacted? To what extent do our design solutions transform power, and how do we know? And what do people in the community identify as their needs and core equity challenges? From there, we move into the inquire phase, where we co-design and develop stakeholder surveys, interviews, and focus groups so that we can validate or invalidate the assumptions that we've made to date and learn more about what we don't know that we don't know. We want to focus on understanding more deeply. Have we invited multiple perspectives and created an environment that encourages everyone to share ideas without fear of judgment? Next, we move into the imagine and prototype phase, where we'll develop a motivations and needs-based approach to our website content strategy through sitemap and wireframe creation. And we have a couple different tools that we use in order to do this in a little bit different of a way. During this phase, we often will ask ourselves, are we making our brainstorming process accessible to everyone? Did we choose methods that allow people to contribute according to their strengths? Are we giving ourselves permission to consider ideas that may not feel possible in order to move past status quo solutions? And what will this prototype help us learn about the situation, system, and problem? And finally, the last phase here is we enter the try phase, where we develop and launch the site. But circling back and getting stakeholder feedback along the way and A/B testing functionality and design attributes to continue and improve our outcomes. We'll ask ourselves if we're creating the conditions to try our prototype so that it's safe to fail and learn, meaning not at risk of creating harm in something that we're experimenting on. What are we trying to learn about what we have designed and how we're trying to learn it? What new understandings have been revealed about the equity design challenge and opportunities to interrupt inequity? This is obviously a super quick overview of our project process, and many of these things will happen in multiple points within the process and circling back, but going sort of around the circle is the easiest in this presentation. But for now, we're going to focus our example on the inquiry phase of a project, because it's really the main place where we can collect stakeholder input throughout our design process.
Okay, so we'll share an example, but before we share an example, we just wanted to share this quote from the National Equity Project. So whatever we know, it is not sufficient. We can't see enough of the whole. We can't figure it out alone. Somebody sees something that the rest of us might not see. And it's from Margaret Wheatley. Our example, stakeholder feedback, taking the time to notice and reflect throughout the design process. So we'd like to share with you an example that took place during the inquire phase of our project process, with a focus on the equity challenges that we faced at the individual, team, client, and partnership levels. Before we go deeper into our experience, we'll start with some context, just so a little bit more clear. We were redesigning a website where the organization had tasked us with understanding the needs and motivations of the community better, and how community members were interacting with the training products they deliver. With their organization having to move a lot of their projects online during COVID, as well as that they have a community that is increasingly aging out of their offerings. As a predominantly white-led organization where white women hold the most power and representation, our clients asked us to dig deeper into understanding how they could make their communications offerings feel more inclusive to BIPOC, so Black, Indigenous, people of color, and LGBTQA+ and under 40 age groups. Where our example begins, we had already conducted and analyzed over 2,300 community surveys. We had conducted individual stakeholder interviews, as well as one focus group that contains a diversity of lived experiences across age, gender, sexual orientation, and race. At this point, Val and I had done a fair amount of discussion around findings within our team. The reflections and insights that we were holding already were that there were a variety of equity challenges that were going to need to be addressed. In particular, that of the groups we mentioned, so the BIPOC and the LGBTQA+ community. We're not feeling those groups were not feeling represented in the organization's communication materials and website content. The community members who did engage said that they focused their energies on finding the places, teachers, and programs that they did feel inclusive or aligned with their personal goals, taking a more observation-based approach to engagement and discounting feelings that felt too white.
So this example is about the final focus group we conducted and how our processing of that experience as individuals and as a team influenced our project outcomes going forward. We also think it's a particularly good example of how using a noticing and reflecting based approach allowed us to design in partnership with our client and their community members more effectively, ultimately making choices and decisions through facilitation rather than based primarily in our own expertise or viewpoints. and in this case, biases as well. Going into this particular focus group, I had felt the need to mentally prepare myself ahead of time, knowing it would be composed of white, cisgendered, straight women who, as we shared earlier, are the ones that hold the most positional power and representation within this organization. I had selected these particular participants based on their survey comments because they represented a range of needs and motivations within this empowered group. To date, this organization had focused primarily on their needs. So already knowing how excluded BIPOC and LGBTQA+ community members were feeling, I entered this particular focus group with certain expectations around what I would hear and the frustration it might make me feel.
I was coming in with the assumption about the group's beliefs were also, particularly based on the survey responses. While it was my intention to be fully present and listen to the experiences they took time to share with me, I drifted into solution mode. Hearing the responses, the tone, the values, and the responses felt very different from the one-on-one interviews that we conducted. As they shared their thoughts, I consistently stripped out the tone, what they were saying, the values that I might not agree with, and moved into seeing the feedback that they were proposing as the same feedback as those that I did agree with. So it's like I stripped out part of it and just focused on how it overlapped. That said, and that wasn't the intention. I was meant to be present and not judgmental. Our job in these spaces is to listen, but we are also not robots. So while I'm acknowledging that our job is to listen, we're also acknowledging that we're not robots. There's no escaping having these defensive and frustrated feelings. It's more about how we process them individually and turn them into something actionable.
After the focus group was over, I can say I was feeling pretty triggered. Needed to spend some time questioning where my continued irritation and defensiveness were stemming from. This is where the notice and reflect really comes into play. I was curious whether these feelings were coming from my own marginalization or own lived experiences, and what may have been white saviorism, or what was stemming from a place of advocacy and activism. Did I only want to understand their perspectives so that I could dismantle them? It was through discussion with our design team, and we're a small firm, so that's only 3 people. We were able to recognize the shapes and forms oppression was taking in this context. And as we noticed our feelings and reflected on what equity challenges were at play, we were able to brainstorm together what we needed to bring back to our client and how we could share our findings in a way that would build connection across these groups. So this last piece, and I realize we're just at time, these were the questions that we brought back to our client for them to reflect on and for us to get some additional information around. And what it really helped us do is to gain a deeper understanding and connection to our client, but also understand how we could use content strategy, brand messaging, and information architecture workflows to transform the user experience into a more positive one for all site visitors. So Mabel, if you want to just close us out because we're at time.
We hope you enjoyed hearing a little bit about our journey and our warts and the liberatory design process. And it really invites us to build, to think, and learn collectively, and dedicate time and space for people to bring forward their full selves and identities. So please join us in rethinking design process so that they are more collective and center the needs of those most impacted by their by the decisions that we make throughout.
So if you have any questions, please feel free to email us. You're welcome to share this deck with people. We really take an open source mindset to all of the work that we do. And the last closing activity as we head out is if you can share into the chat any one thing that you want to spend some more time thinking about. And thank you all for having us. Oh, thanks, Alex.
Thank you both for the fantastic presentation.